Welcome to my madness, ladies and gentlemen. Today, I want to talk about movies. In general, I want to talk about Spider-Man movies. You know, in the last 22 years, we have gotten 8 different Spider-Man movies amongst 3 different separate franchises within the Spider-Man franchise. We've gotten the Raimi trilogy, the Amazing Spider-Man duology, and then, of course, the MCU trilogy. And obviously, a lot of what your personal opinion is on which of these 3 versions of Spider-Man and his stories is going to partly be based on what you grew up with. I mean, people in their 30s and over are going to probably more lean towards the Raimi trilogy because that was what they grew up with. People who are in their 20s probably very, very fondly remember the 2 Amazing Spider-Man movies. And people of a younger generation obviously are going to default to the MCU trilogy of movies because that's what they have the most experience with. But I wanted to see if I could do a little bit of a deep dive and break it down a little more than that to try and determine which overall of these 3 separate versions of Spider-Man are actually the best. So I want to start with what I think are 7 key elements of what makes for not just a good Spider-Man story, but key elements to the character of Spider-Man himself and the world he lives in. And those key elements are going to be: who's his girlfriend? Who are the villains? Who's his best friend? Who is the school bully? Spider-Man himself as a character, Peter Parker as a separate character, and then, of course, the iconic costume. So first, let's talk about the girlfriend, which is a very key element to Peter Parker and Spider-Man stories, and always has been in the comic books. If we look at the MCU version of Peter Parker's girlfriend, we get MJ, played by Zendaya, or however you say her name, I don't know. Now, I want to be real clear. I don't have any problem with her as an actress, but I do not think this character is written very well. She's not written as a particularly likable character, and throughout basically most of our time with her on screen, she's also not really seen as a particularly valuable character to either Peter Parker as a teenager or to Spider-Man as a superhero, except for a couple of very rare instances in the 3rd movie. I just don't think she's a well-written character, certainly not in any way, shape, or form comic book accurate. I mean, we don't have an actual, MJ character whose name is only MJ because the initials stand for something else. In general, she's probably the worst instance in the 3 that we see of Peter Parker's girlfriend. She's just not a well-developed character, and while there's definitely on-screen chemistry because, in real life, her and Tom Holland actually were an item, it just doesn't really work well if you're going for the more traditional feel of what Peter Parker's girlfriend is supposed to be. And then, of course, we have the original Sam Raimi trilogy, right? Kirsten Dunst as Mary Jane, the actual Mary Jane, and while I think she did a pretty good job, she certainly could have done a lot better. And in fact, I don't necessarily think it was so much Kirsten Dunst's fault that the character wasn't as good as it should have been, especially if you're going to compare her to MJ in the comics. A lot of it was just, to be honest, miscasting. Kirsten Dunst was just not a good person, not a good actress to play the role of Mary Jane. I mean, she just didn't have the vibe of the kind of upbeat, girl clearly out of Peter Parker's league that would eventually grow up to become a very famous model and pretty much the hottest woman on the planet, at least in Peter Parker's world. She just didn't pull that off very well, and in fact, a lot of times came off a lot more kind of whiny and needy as opposed to the kind of overly confident girl who Peter Parker felt lucky to be with. And it just, while it was good and certainly better than the MJ we got in the MCU, it wasn't where it should have been. All right, so now let's talk about Emma Stone as Gwen Stacy. Now, she was pretty much spot on with a few tweaks here and there. Very well done character. I thought Emma Stone, even though I'm not the biggest fan of her as an actress, did a great job. I thought they expanded on the character in a really good, cool, modern way that made sense for the character. I mean, ultimately, she's still the girl next door, loves Peter for who he is, supports him as Spider-Man, and if you look at those movies, was also very beneficial to Peter Parker's life as a teenager and very beneficial to his life as Spider-Man, and that's what we want out of Peter Parker's quote-unquote girlfriend. So easily, hands down, Amazing Spider-Man wins when it comes to the best girlfriend. Alright, so now let's talk about the villains of these three different franchises here. We'll start with Amazing Spider-Man, because let's be honest, these villains weren't great. I mean, Lizard was okay in the first movie, albeit strange motivations to turn everyone into a lizard, but he was a good enough villain to keep the story moving along for kind of Peter Parker's first outing as Spider-Man, so it was fine. But then we get to Amazing Spider-Man 2, and we have a horribly miscast Electro and a Harry Osborn version of Green Goblin that didn't even need to be in the movie. He just made things worse. And I'm not talking about the fact that, oh no, spoiler alert, he killed Gwen Stacy. I'm talking about the fact that the character was just really, really poorly done. It was a ridiculous and insane and dumb version of Green Goblin. So, yeah, clearly this is not the choice for best villains in a Spider-Man movie. So then we get to the MCU, and the MCU's got a lot of things going for it when it comes to villains, okay? Michael Keaton as Vulture was great. I thought he did a really good job. It's not the traditional Vulture that I know from the comics. They made a whole lot of changes to better fit within the MCU structure, but I still thought it was a really good character, even if it wasn't very comic book accurate. And I can say pretty much the same thing for Jake Gyllenhaal's Mysterio as well. While I wasn't a big fan of them tweaking his origins, from being kind of a special effects stuntman type of character to somebody that worked for Tony Stark, I still thought Jake Gyllenhaal did a good job, and I thought it worked for the movie he was in. And then, of course, there is Spider-Man No Way Home. Those villains are absolutely fantastic, but you can't really give that credit to the MCU version of Spider-Man and those movies because, well, we got those villains from the two previous incarnations of Spider-Man. So while they're great, and I thought Green Goblin and even Sandman and everyone else in there did a really good job and made for really good villains for that movie, that wasn't where they got their start. So clearly the winner here when it comes to best Spider-Man villains is going to the Raimi trilogy. I mean, there's just no doubt about that. Willem Dafoe as Green Goblin was top-notch. I mean, Doc Ock in Spider-Man 2 was perfection. And even in the third movie, while a lot of people complain about the villains in that movie, yes, I agree with you. Venom was not very well done. And to be honest, again, Harry Osborn's try at being the Green Goblin was not needed in this movie. Don't forget that Thomas Hayden Church as Sandman was incredibly well done. And in fact, had you just made that a Sandman movie, it very well may have been the best Spider-Man movie that we have gotten ever, simply because it was such a well done character. And what that movie really suffered from was overuse of multiple villains instead of focusing on one, in this case, Sandman, whose story played out beautifully. A story of trying to save his daughter and eventually getting redemption to help Spider-Man. It was a really, really well done story, very beautifully acted by Thomas Hayden Church. So 3 solid villains in 3 movies. Ultimately, Sam Raimi trilogy has the best villains. Alright, so now let's talk about Peter Parker's best friend. Alright, so in the Amazing Spider-Man movies, we get Harry Osborn. Horribly cast by, I don't even remember the actor's name, if I'm honest. Just not well done at all. It's a horrible version of Harry Osborn, and he's not even in the first movie. In the first movie, Peter doesn't even have, seemingly, a best friend, and in the second movie shows up, feels kind of shoehorned in, and then just becomes a crappy version of Green Goblin. Horrible across the board, not even worth mentioning any further. And then, of course, we get to Ned in the MCU version of Spider-Man, and Ned's pretty good. I like Ned quite a bit. Very likable character. Makes a great best friend for Peter Parker. Is he perfect? No. Does he really necessarily add a lot of the dynamic that some of the other characters we've seen in the comics add to Peter Parker slash Spider-Man's life? Not really, but still really well done. And then, of course, we get down to the Raimi trilogy once again, where Harry Osborn, Peter Parker's best friend, played by James Franco, done absolutely perfectly. He was the perfect best friend in all three of those movies, had a great story arc tying him to Peter Parker and then to Spider-Man. We saw the way the character developed over 3 movies, and while I'm not the biggest fan of James Franco as an actor, in those movies, he was a great character for Peter Parker's life, to be kind of that yin to his yang as a friend, to kind of, in many cases, keep him in line when nothing else would, to get him on the right path, even though ultimately the right path would lead him to being Spider-Man, and then ultimately Harry would try to kill him as Spider-Man. We still saw a really great story of 2 best friends coming together, falling apart, then coming together again. Beautifully done. Hands down, Raimi trilogy wins this one. Alright, now let's get to the school bully, which, if you've read Spider-Man comics, especially the early stuff when he was still in high school, the school bully always played a pretty important role in Peter Parker's life. Not usually for the better, but certainly an important role that pushed him into becoming the man he needed to become to be Spider-Man. Now, in the MCU trilogy, we got Flash, which wasn't really Flash Thompson, and he wasn't really even a bully, he was just kind of a douchebag. And while I have no problem with that actor, I've seen him in other things, and I actually do like that actor, I thought this rendition of Peter Parker's bully was just pitifully done. He's not even really a bully. He's just kind of an annoyance more than anything else, and not only an annoyance to Peter Parker, but honestly, also to the audience. And then, of course, we get to the Raimi trilogy, where we had the first time I ever saw Joe Manganiello do anything on screen, and he played Flash Thompson in those movies. And I thought he did a pretty decent job for the character he was trying to portray and the way it was written, but to be honest, he's really only in the first movie, and he really only has a couple of scenes, only a few lines, and other than just kind of being shown as a bully that messes around with Peter for the sake of, in a couple of scenes, being able to show off Peter Parker's new, Spidey sense ability, he doesn't really make much of an impact on the audience or much of an impact on Peter Parker's life. And then, of course, there is an actor by the name of Chris Zylka. I don't even know how to say the dude's name, and I know I've seen him in several things throughout the years. Of course, he played Flash Thompson in the Amazing Spider-Man movies 1 and 2, and this was actually I think, great choice. Whether it was the actor himself or just the writing for the character, they took just a handful of small, quick scenes, especially in the first Amazing Spider-Man movie, and managed to make a pretty good, thoughtful, provoking, well-rounded bully character in those movies. Again, he's not in the movie very much at all, and when we first see him, he's just being a dick and a douchebag to Peter Parker. But then that all kind of culminates after Peter Parker's Uncle Ben dies, and we see this really good scene between Flash and Peter in the hallway, where Peter is, of course, expecting Flash to come up to him and start bullying him, and in fact, he doesn't. He actually tells him that he's sorry that his uncle died, and that it's okay, and that he knows how it feels. And even though it's just a handful of scenes, we get a really well-rounded character there that made for some compelling storytelling and some great scenes, and in fact made for a character that I would have been very interested to see go on and kind of do some of the things in a movie series that Flash Thompson actually did in the comics, like eventually becoming the host for the Venom symbiote and actually becoming a really cool character. I could actually see that version of Flash actually become that better version of himself, and for that reason, Amazing Spider-Man is definitely the franchise with the best bully. Alright, so now let's talk about Spider-Man himself. Spider-Man, you say, but isn't he always Spider-Man? And yes, but not really, especially if you're a huge fan of the comics like I am. I mean, Spider-Man in the comics was a very different character from Peter Parker, especially looking at the high school years for Peter Parker. I mean, Peter Parker was a very, very timid, nerdy geek who didn't speak up for himself, didn't say anything. Even when he got his powers, he still acted very differently as Spider-Man than he did as Peter Parker. When he became Spider-Man, he got much more confident. He was very quirky and sarcastic and always had the seemingly right thing to say to a villain in any given moment. And it was a very, very clear division between when he had the costume on and when he didn't. So let's talk about the MCU version of Spider-Man. Is it any good? Well, sure, it's pretty good, but it's not great. And in fact, it's very un-comic book accurate in the sense that, to be honest, Tom Holland plays Spider-Man exactly like he plays Peter Parker. He's playing the same character whether he has the costume on or not, essentially. He doesn't really make that kind of clear differentiation between the two characters, thus kind of deeper exploring the duality of Peter Parker and kind of the confidence boost he gets when he puts on the mask. That's just really not something that's explored at all in the MCU. And so while I still really love those movies, that's certainly not the best version of Spider-Man as a character. So now let's talk about the Raimi trilogy here. I mean, the Raimi trilogy, when it comes to showing those two different sides to Peter Parker, I think does a really, really good job. I mean, he plays a great Peter Parker. He also plays an excellent Spider-Man. But it's not a perfect Spider-Man. While it is definitely a clear, choice between two separate characters, seemingly, and you can kind of understand why people don't know that Peter Parker is Spider-Man, it's not quite up to the quippy level that we see in the comic books. So while it is beautifully done and wonderfully acted by Tobey Maguire, I think it could be a little bit more, at least when he's in the costume. And that, of course, leads us into the Amazing Spider-Man's version of Spider-Man, where we get Andrew Garfield essentially playing a one-to-one copy of the comic book version of Spider-Man, of what Peter Parker is like when he's in the costume. I thought that Andrew Garfield did a perfect job coming off as much more confident and quippy and intelligent, but also playful, and pretty much everything that if you've read the comics, have learned to love about Spider-Man when he puts on the mask. It was pretty much perfect, and for that reason, you got to give it to Andrew Garfield in the Amazing Spider-Man duology for Best Spider-Man. And now let's talk about his alter ego, Peter Parker. We'll start with Amazing Spider-Man because this is clearly the worst Peter Parker, especially given the time frame we're supposed to be looking at for Peter Parker. This is him in 11th and 12th grade. This is him still fresh in high school. This is him right after he got his powers. He's supposed to be an incredibly huge nerd and geek. Somebody who's picked on all the time, yet what we get is kind of an antisocial, cool Peter Parker. And I get that they wanted to tweak it for the times, maybe just a little bit, but I just don't think it works for Peter Parker. He played Peter Parker more like we see him in the comics once he gets into his 20s, once he gets older and marries Mary Jane and is a little more confident in himself as Peter Parker than when he puts the mask on. And we got kind of that version, which, again, if we were doing a Spider-Man movie about Spider-Man at the age of 27, would have been a great choice to go with for kind of a personality trait for Peter Parker, but that's not what we were dealing with. And so for that reason, unfortunately, as much as I like Andrew Garfield as Spider-Man himself, I think he kind of makes the worst Peter Parker. And of course, we get to MCU's Peter Parker. Tom Holland, I think, does a really, really good job to portray a good modern take on Peter Parker. And I don't really see any flaws with how that character was portrayed. I thought it was spot on. It's kind of what you would expect a modern geek to be like, somebody who's kind of a science nerd, that kind of thing. And it's really, really well done. However, it's not perfect, and while I like it quite a bit, and I do think it makes sense in a modern perspective, it's still not the Peter Parker that I remember from the comics. He's almost a little too cool, not by much, but maybe just a little bit. And also, he's essentially just a young Tony Stark. He's kind of a genius. And while in the comics, Peter Parker does eventually get there, he's not there at 16 years old like the MCU's version of Peter Parker is. And then, of course, there's Tobey Maguire as Peter Parker in the Raimi trilogy, and he's just perfect. I mean, let's be honest here. He's absolutely perfect. That is a spot-on Peter Parker. He is geeky and nerdy and picked on and lacks confidence, but still is a wholesome, earnest, likable character, and you understand why him becoming Spider-Man really does change him and make him a very different person. And it's just so beautifully done. Tobey Maguire is just a phenomenal actor pretty much anyway across the board, and his turn at Peter Parker by far still is the best and has yet to be topped. So finally, we've got to talk about the suit, because the suit itself, to be honest, when it comes to Spider-Man, man, it plays a really big role in how I feel about whether or not a franchise has done it right. I mean, I'm used to that very, very classic costume, and while in the comics, Spider-Man's had quite a few different costumes, he always comes back to the classic red and blue, and it is iconic, not just in the comic books, but in pop culture worldwide. That costume is as well known as Superman's costume or Batman's costume, and with good reason. Okay? He is a classic character and one of the most popular fictional characters in the world. And so, did any of these movies actually get it right? Well, let's start with the MCU, where no, they never got it right. Let's be honest here. The MCU had pretty much like 2 costumes in every single one of their movies, and none of them were spot on to the comics. They were all clearly inspired by the comics, and they were all very clearly Spider-Man costumes, but none of them kind of evoked that same emotion and reaction and nostalgia of the original comic book look for Spider-Man, short of maybe about the 5 seconds we got at the very end of No Way Home, where he was in the homemade costume, but we didn't get a clear look at it, so it's kind of hard to use that to say that all those movies did a great job on the Spider-Man suit, because honestly, while I think it made sense from an MCU perspective, and I think it made sense, all the costume tweaks they did throughout those movies from a modern perspective, none of them were perfect. And then we get to the Raimi trilogy, which did, in my opinion, a fantastic job with recreating the Spider-Man costume from the comics. They did make some tweaks for the movie, and it's not perfect one-to-one to the comic books, to that classic costume. There's still the large silver webbing that almost looks metal. I don't know, was that supposed to be some sort of, support structure for him? I don't know. It looked really cool on screen, not exactly comic book accurate, but very, very well done, solid design. If that's the only design we had ever gotten in the movies for a Spider-Man, I would have been happy with it. And he did maintain that look throughout all 3 movies, short of when he got the Venom symbiote, but we don't really want to talk about that. So really, really well done, really solid, and I thought they did a fantastic job with that costume. And then, of course, we get to Amazing Spider-Man. And yes, while in the first Amazing Spider-Man, his first kind of homemade costume looked more like something Ben Reilly would wear instead of Peter Parker, there is no denying that in Amazing Spider-Man 2, we got essentially a one-to-one recreation of the classic Spider-Man costume that we are used to seeing in the comics. It is absolutely perfect, hands down the best Spider-Man costume we've ever gotten on screen, and it deserves all the credit for taking those images drawn by the likes of Steve Ditko and Todd McFarlane and Eric Larson and so many others, and translating that look so beautifully to screen. Hands down, when it comes to the best Spider-Man suit, we have to give that one to Amazing Spider-Man, especially Amazing Spider-Man 2. So if we just go by the numbers right there, we are at 4-3 Amazing Spider-Man versus Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, with unfortunately the MCU version of Spider-Man not winning in any of these categories. And ultimately, Amazing Spider-Man, when it comes to the costume, when it comes to Spider-Man, when it comes to the girlfriend, when it comes to the bully, They got more checkpoints going for them than any of the other franchises do. But I cannot stop there. We've got to kind of just throw in something else that kind of is just kind of an unknown factor of how these movies were put together, and whether it was cinematography, direction, choice of actors, storytelling, or just a combination of all those things put together, and little hints and bits of things that have been thrown into the movies that really kind of combine to make a difference. We kind of have to come down on the side of what movie gave us the best Spider-Man origin, with Uncle Ben's death, him getting bit by the spider, him actually being a wrestler for a short period of time. Overall, the most comic accurate versions of the villains. I mean, we know which villains were played the best, but which were the most comic book accurate? Which had the most comic book accurate side characters like Aunt May and the Osborns and J. Jonah Jameson? You know, which felt most like a direct translation of comic book to screen? You know, all these things do play a part, and when you take all these things into consideration, when you look at the 7 key points that make for a good Spider-Man movie, when you take in all those kind of offbeat wow factors that sometimes you can't really explain to put together a movie that just make it great, ultimately what it comes down to is, regardless of what the 7 bullet points said, hands down, I've got to give it to the Raimi trilogy. Yes, Amazing Spider-Man had a better version of Spider-Man and the costume and a better girlfriend, but ultimately, the Sam Raimi trilogy is one of the greatest trilogies of movies of all time. Not just Spider-Man movies, but movies, period, hands down. If you've never watched these movies, first of all, what is wrong with you? Second, go do it right now. But seriously, maybe even if you haven't watched these movies in a while, these movies are absolutely fantastic. The Raimi trilogy, even the third one, which leaves a lot to be desired, is still one of the best Spider-Man movies we've gotten. I'd still rather watch that than most of the MCU movies other than No Way Home, and I'd still rather watch that in either of the Amazing Spider-Man movies, because it's still better than those movies, even though it did have a lot of issues. Look, Raimi just put together a perfect cast and story and cinematography and villains, and just made it work in a way that nobody else has been able to do yet. And for that reason, ultimately, when it comes down to it, the Sam Raimi trilogy of Spider-Man movies still holds as the best version of Spider-Man.